It is an honor to be here on behalf of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies to outline the array of cross-border security threats that China continues to inspire to harm U.S. national security, our competitiveness, and the health and safety of our citizens. The booming criminal markets are fueling a multi-trillion-dollar global economy that undermines U.S. competitive policies. The United Nations has estimated that dirty money laundered from such criminal activities is between 2 to 5% of global GDP. China is a common denominator in expanding many of these illicit economies. Fentanyl, which is killing tens of thousands of Americans each year, is bought by the Mexican cartels and facilitated by Chinese criminal groups. When the fentanyl illegal trade converges with other criminal activities, the overall threat becomes multiplied many times over, including when China's state-sponsored IP theft and economic espionage of U.S. trade secrets harms our companies at an estimated $600 billion. Similarly, China trades in counterfeits is flooding U.S. markets, accounting for 80 to 90% of all counterfeits seized in the U.S. and globally. The National Association of Manufacturers released a report last year finding that counterfeits sapped the U.S. economy $131 billion and 325,000 jobs in 2019. Across illicit commerce platforms, internet marketplaces, fake goods have increased the health and safety risk to all Americans. During the current pandemic, predatory criminals generated tens of billions of dollars in selling fake PPE, mostly coming from China. The proliferation of counterfeited electronics hurts not only our electronic industry, but threatens the safety of our troops, including when they have been found to infiltrate critical military systems and supply chains. Every IP-protected product can be counterfeited. This is true for all consumer goods and services, but especially for the footwear and apparel industry, in which American brands are highly counterfeited, such as Nike, Under Armour, Polo, and sportwears from the National Football League, Major League Baseball, NBA, and NHL. Like other forms of illicit trade, the illegal tobacco trade is very profitable for criminal organizations, kleptocratic networks, and terrorist groups. The China Tobacco Corporation is by far the largest cigarette company in the world and produces half of the world's cigarettes, which are moved illicitly through free trade zones and unregulated markets. Auto parts, similarly, coming from China, counterfeit auto parts end up hurting Americans and really are auto companies like Ford, GM, and Tesla. Illegal logging, fishing, and mining of natural resources not only harm our natural world, but contribute to climate change and the financing of other converging threats. Chinese criminals are expanding their ties with the Mexican cartels and other criminals in the U.S., Canada, and Latin America, diversifying into areas such as human trafficking and environmental crime. China constitutes the biggest money laundering hub in the world, responsible for about half of the world's laundering in the world today. Trade fraud or trade-based money laundering are perfect asymmetrical threat vehicles to transfer money valued by kleptocrats, criminals, and terrorists in the form of trade goods out of the country by importing goods at overvalued prices or exporting goods at undervalued prices. China's Belt Road Initiative footprint tracks some of the biggest illicit trade routes known for corruption, money laundering, and an array of traffic contraband as a conduit for China to expand and bridge a superhighway of illicit economies globally while saddling parts of the developing world with debt traps. Finally, in a call for action, we must heighten the political pressure in China and elevate the global fight against illicit economies in Congress as a national security priority, including through a bipartisan congressional caucus. We must empower law enforcement agencies with new legal authorities and develop a national strategy to combat trade-based money laundering and related supply chain criminal infiltration and market penetration. In closing, China must become a more responsible partner and end the corruptive influence of bad actors exploiting today's illicit economies that are sabotaging legitimate commerce, prosperity, American competitiveness, and the economic growth of nations who play by the global trade system of rules and by the rule of law. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I think I've read that as much as $1 billion a day flows out of China in terms of capital flight. Is that just a figure I vaguely remember, or is there any, what is their capital flight issue?
I think that's correct. There's been numerous international organizations who have put those estimates, and they could be conservative estimates.
Really? Now, you speak about trade-based money laundering. I'm very concerned about that. It seems as if trade-based money laundering is a way that somebody can move capital from China to a country outside of China, and under, if you will, avoiding Chinese government scrutiny, et cetera. So if you will, their participation in the TBML is not necessarily to further criminal activity, but to get their capital out. Is that possible?
That's a fair assessment, Senator. Going back to your earlier question, if you look at the proceeds of corruption since 1995, they're up to $2 trillion. In my testimony earlier, I mentioned that China's money laundering hub up to $1.5 to $2 trillion a year.
$2 trillion a year. Now, the Chinese government is a surveillance society. I guess I'm a little bit, how are they so incapable of capturing what might be a conservative estimate of $1 billion of capital flight per day?
Good question, Senator. It's a little bit complex there. I think the issue of complicity is part of the challenge.
Now, complicity in terms of a corrupt official or in terms of official?
Correct. Not necessarily at the national. It could very be a disconnect between the national and the subnational corrupt officials in the various provinces across China. In fact, that's where you see often the high level of corruption in China.
So although we see many things that China does as threatening to the West, this is actually an area that we could potentially, I think you highlight in this your testimony, an area that we could potentially cooperate on, which is to address the trade-based money laundering aspect of, which would address in turn their concern about capital flight. Is that a fair statement?
Correct. I do think political pressure by the Congress, the Biden administration working together, bringing China to the table. If you just look at the various illicit markets and weave them together, China, again, is the common denominator and the major player in the global illegal economy.
I'll come back to that because I think it's Chair Warren's turn. I'm a few minutes over. Can I go? So then let me ask, because it seems like we had a tension here. On the one hand, they export more, albeit counterfeit goods, which helps their economy. On the other hand, this may be a vehicle by which there's capital flight. Is there a tension there, or am I only imagining it?
Well, there's illicit trade, but on the illicit trade, they do exploit illicit trade to move capital flight and to move criminally derived proceeds.
So even though it's illicit goods, they're just mismatching the pricing between the recipient country and China in order to move capital out.
Correct. It could be overvaluation, undervaluation, or mispricing. Correct.
So the Chinese government would, in that case, they're savvy enough to evade the Chinese government surveillance. Correct.
The complicit corrupt officials. Correct.
Okay. And then I'm through with you, and then we'll come back. I'll ask our other witness about a way to address that.